Kia ora tātou, ko kolandoati te rangatira o mana whananga pira he mana mutahaki, the Independent Police Conduct Authority. This media conference is for the purpose of releasing the authority's report setting out the findings of our review into the policing of the Parliament protest and occupation, which lasted for 23 days from 8 February to 2 March last year, 2022. As Chair of the Authority, I'm pleased we've been able to complete this significant piece of work, largely on time and within budget. Our investigation and review of the policing of the protest and occupation followed our receiving the highest number of complaints the Authority has ever received about a single incident, 1,905 complaints. The project that has culminated in this report commenced in March last year following our announcing the scope of our review. To enable us to complete the review within the time frame, we established a dedicated project team which concentrated solely on this work. We are satisfied that we have conducted a thorough review. We obtained and assessed more than 4,000 documents from police, protesters and other interested parties. We received and reviewed digital footage from a variety of sources: complainants, members of the public, police, media outlets and the Wellington City Council. In total, there were 6,540 video files requiring more than 1,300 hours of viewing. We interviewed 377 people, some more than once. 193 were police officers and police employees. 62 were individual protesters and representatives of protest groups. 70 were other impacted parties. 34 were staff from government agencies and organisations that provided operational support to police. 18 were key interested parties, including the Prime Minister, the Mayor of Wellington and the Speaker of the House at the time of the protest. Following analysis of all the material that we gathered, we reached findings about how New Zealand Police dealt with the protest and occupation. Before I summarise those findings, or the major findings, I need to emphasise that the review naturally focuses on areas where we feel police practice fell short of the ideal and on lessons that can be learnt for the future. This should not be interpreted as finding that police failed in their policing of the protest and occupation. Overall, we think police served the public of New Zealand well. On the final day, frontline officers faced extreme provocation and violence and a level of public disorder rarely seen in New Zealand. In the face of that, almost all officers exercise professionalism and restraint. In our view, it's highly commendable that police were able to end the illegal occupation with as few injuries and as little damage to property as they did. It's easy to forget over a year later what was happening within New Zealand and the world and the context that led to the protest and occupation. In particular, much of the New Zealand workforce, including police, was directly affected by the coronavirus. Significant staff shortages caused by COVID-19 hampered the police reaction to the occupation. The story of the protest has been told many times, and often by you, the media, but it's worth briefly recapping. Initially, protesters travelled by vehicle convoy from both ends of the country and arrived at Parliament on 8 February. In that, they mimicked protest action reported as occurring in both Canada and Australia. The focus of the majority of the protesters was on ending vaccine mandates and other COVID-19 related restrictions. However, within the protesters, there were a number of groups with other agendas and grievances against the government. The occupation of the grounds of Parliament, surrounding streets and some adjacent properties, caused significant disruption to Parliament itself and to key government and judicial institutions, schools and businesses in the area, and the commuter public at a time when New Zealand was in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. On 10 February, police mounted an operation to end the occupation and clear protesters from Parliament grounds. The operation that day did not achieve its objective. Over the following 3 weeks, police managed and contained the extent of the protest as best they could, while they planned for an eventual major operation to bring the occupation of Parliament grounds and the other compromised properties in its vicinity to an end. Police undertook that operation on 2 March. It began at 6 a.m. and continued throughout the day. Protesters resisted, some violently, and caused significant damage to Parliament grounds. By 3:30 p.m. the situation deteriorated into a riot, during which fires were lit and some of the protesters remaining violently attacked the advancing police line using a variety of objects as weapons. It was not until that evening that police succeeded in dispersing the protesters and ending the occupation. This review is intended to provide police, interested parties and the general public with an independent assessment of the information police had, the decisions police took, the tactics they used, and whether the approach taken to policing the protest as it evolved was lawful, proportionate and appropriate. With this review, we aim to make a constructive contribution to ongoing work within police to improve responses to events such as this and the development of public order policing more generally. The review looks at police's initial response to the impending protest from the time they became aware of the likely convoy from both ends of the country to Parliament through to that final operation on 2 March. With that in mind, let me turn to the findings. Prior to the commencement of the protest on 8 February 2022, and from as early as November the year before, police intelligence staff gathered and provided very good information about the developing protest environment, and they communicated it to a wide range of police decision makers in advance. However, in response to that information, police did not sufficiently consider the particular risks posed by this event, especially given the disruption reported from similar recent convoys in Australia and Canada. They should have consulted Wellington City Council well before the arrival of the convoy about whether there was need for a traffic management plan, and they should have prepared and disseminated a detailed operation plan. However, it does need to be said that doing so would not necessarily have resulted in any additional reaction, for example, the closing of the roads around Parliament, nor would it have necessarily changed the evolution of the protest. After several hundred protesters had set up tents and structures on Parliament grounds and Victoria University's Pipitea campus on 8 February, the Speaker closed Parliament grounds and the protesters became trespassers. Police made the decision on the 9 February to take action the next day to remove the trespassers and effectively end the occupation of Parliament grounds. We have found that while this decision was made following a discussion between the Commissioner of Police, the then Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Attorney General, there was no undue political interference, and the Commissioner reached his own independent view on the action police should take. Despite arresting 108 people in the process, and that was primarily for trespass, police were unsuccessful in their attempt to remove the protesters and ended up withdrawing about 4:40 that afternoon. We think there are a number of aspects of the operation that day where things should have been done differently. First, police should have been more prepared for the operation in terms of planning, resourcing, staff and equipment. Secondly, leaders did not clearly communicate to staff what was intended. Thirdly, they initially failed to provide all protesters with the required warnings that they must leave Parliament grounds in the manner required by the Trespass Act 1980. Fourthly, while the degree of force they used to make the 108 arrests was generally reasonable, the arrest process itself and the recording of evidence was deficient. Many of the charges against protesters were later withdrawn for this reason. Fifthly, they were unprepared to physically deal with so many arrests and so many people in custody, which meant they were unable to comply with all legal and policy requirements governing the treatment of detainees in custody. Finally, the decision to cease the operation should have been made earlier in the day when it became apparent that it would not achieve its objective. However, even if all of these issues had been properly addressed, we think it unlikely that the operation would have been successful. But I need to make it clear that in our view, that doesn't mean the 10 February operation should not have been undertaken. What it did demonstrate to the community at large was that police were confronted with a difficult situation and that easy options to end the occupation at that time were not available. Arguably, therefore, it maintained a level of community support for their strategy to bring the occupation to an end, and it bought them time to plan for that. So let me now turn to consider our findings on what police did do between 11 February and 1 March. And that was to contain the protest and maintain law and order while planning for a larger operation on 2 March. In our view, their strategy over this period was generally the right one. It was a major logistical exercise to bring the occupation to an end, and police had neither the capacity nor the capability to do that quickly. They needed time to plan and to marshal the required resources. Additionally, the compounding demands of day-to-day policing and staff shortages from COVID-19 made it difficult for Wellington District Police to do the necessary planning, although they did receive assistance from 15 February when a national operation was established at Police National Headquarters. However, we have found that a more flexible process for providing support to Wellington District should have been in place. Of particular note during this time was the development of a strategy for removing protesters' vehicles that were blocking the streets around Parliament and for restoring traffic flow. Police did not have the capacity to do this on their own, and their attempts to obtain support from tow operators were initially largely unsuccessful. They managed to tow only a few vehicles over this period as a result. But police did successfully use the placement of concrete bollards to contain and then shrink the occupation footprint. This was an important and successful strategy that contributed to the success of the 2 March operation to end it. Finally, I need to outline what we've found about the 2 March operation to bring the occupation to an end. As I said earlier, it began in the early morning. Although many protesters left the scene, police encountered strong and increasing resistance during the day from those who stayed. And during the afternoon, as you'll be aware, some protesters started fires among the tents. Substantial and sustained violence was directed at police. This included throwing a Molotov cocktail, bricks, paving stones, fireworks, poles, bottles, a knife and other projectiles. By late in the day, the protest had degenerated into a riot. At about 6 p.m, a car was used to attack a police line on Lambton Quay. As I said at the outset, in the face of this extreme provocation, while there were some isolated incidents of excessive reactive force by police, they generally acted professionally and with remarkable restraint. We found in this review that all the tactics police used to defend both themselves and others on 2 March were justified in the circumstances. Those tactics included skirmish lines, shields, pushing and striking, pepper spray, batons, sponge round and deflating vehicle tyres, and themselves using weapons of opportunity such as fire extinguishers and fire hoses. The authority has therefore found that the police operation on 2 March 2022 to clear the grounds of Parliament, the Victoria University campus, the cathedral and the surrounding streets was in the main conducted professionally and successfully. However, we did identify a number of deficiencies. First, while police's decision not to allow officers to wear hard body armour from the start of the operation was reasonably open to them, it should have been accompanied by a communication to staff about when and how that decision could be varied in the light of changing circumstances. Because it was not, a number of officers were exposed to unnecessary risk when objects were thrown at them. By at least mid-morning, all officers should have had access to the protective equipment to the extent that it was available, but in any event there was not sufficient supply of it. Secondly, newly graduated officers who were used to boost numbers for the operation had not been adequately prepared or equipped for a role in the operation. It was also undesirable that recruits who had not yet graduated from police college were also required to attend Parliament towards the conclusion of the operation to help secure the ground that police had reclaimed. The need for this arose because of inadequate police planning. Thirdly, although police had identified problems with their mass arrest process on 10 February and tried to address them, issues with evidence collection remained and resulted in some charges laid in respect of protester actions on 2 March being withdrawn. Finally, with the exception of a vehicle extraction plan, police lacked a detailed plan for dealing with property abandoned on Parliament grounds and the surrounding streets and properties. I should conclude by noting that the protest and occupation exposed the ineffectiveness of some current laws. We identified a number of areas where the current law is not fit for purpose for the type of mass public disorder situation that confronted police on 10 February and 2 March. These included the law of trespass, the law governing how arrests may be lawfully effected, and the law governing how property left behind by trespassers should be handled. We have therefore recommended that police propose to government that there be a multi-agency review of the laws governing a public order event such as this. We have made 13 other recommendations to help police improve public order policing. These include develop their own operating model for public order policing as a matter of priority and ensure that it addresses the lessons learnt from this event. Develop standard operating procedures for policing the parliamentary precinct itself, including scenario planning with partner agencies, and a third is to urgently purchase more hard body armour. This was a wide-ranging review. The findings which I have just outlined demonstrate there were some deficiencies in the policing of the occupation which will provide police with valuable lessons in terms of planning for any such event in the future. But let me reiterate what I said earlier. This report should not be interpreted as finding that police failed in their policing of the protest and occupation. We have written it not only to review what police did, but to make a constructive contribution to the ongoing work within police to improve public order policing. We have focused on areas where we think practice fell short of the ideal and where lessons can be learned for the future. You will probably be aware that police have conducted their own internal review, and I'm satisfied as a result of discussions about that police have already started to address many of the issues that are raised in this report. Kia ora, thank you. I'm happy to endeavour to answer any questions you might have.
On the whole, can the public have confidence in the police operation in response to the protest?
In a word, yes.
And to what extent, looking back on it, if police had only made a traffic management plan with Wellington City Council when they were made aware that more than 1,000 cars were coming, they had the intelligence of what had happened in other countries, in your view, could they have prevented the occupation from happening at all?
The intelligence they had was that at least 370 and perhaps up to 1,000 was going to come. It's easy to look at these things in hindsight. Even if they had consulted the Wellington City Council and talked about traffic management, doesn't necessarily follow that they would have blocked off and closed the roads around Parliament. We think that that would have been one of the actions that was high on any list of priorities, but it would not necessarily have happened.
Do you think the events were unavoidable? Do you think the events were unavoidable in a way?
Which events?
Well, just the escalation of the protest.
Well, you'll have to ask the protesters that, but hindsight again shows that this was a protest which was out of the ordinary. Police are well used to dealing with protests and demonstrations at Parliament. They weren't well used to the endeavours that protesters went to here.
You found that 8 actions were unjustified by police. So has there been any disciplinary action for police? And that's, I see 8, is that 8 actions out of 1,900 complaints essentially?
We are looking specifically and doing independent investigations into 19 specific incidences where there are allegations of excessive force. We are not at the stage of having completed all of those, but we have identified, at least on a preliminary basis, that 8 of them, 8 of those may well be justified complaints. We will be reporting on those in the next few weeks to police, and it'll be up to police to take whatever action they think necessary from that. They do, of course, know about these complaints because by operation of our Act, we have to notify police, and we have done so.
This event has been clearly mirrored by other events overseas. You referenced in Canada and Australia. Why do you think police didn't consider that this event could be of a similar level, given the nature of those events?
Well, you might be better to address that question to the Commissioner, but they certainly did have in their intelligence reports that this other action had taken place elsewhere. I don't think police actually thought that what occurred was going to occur.
Can you speak to the risk that the police officers were put in due to the lack of communication, and I'm talking more about the final day and the lack of access to body armour?
Yes. We have not criticised the initial decision by police when they started the clearance at 6 a.m. on that day not to have everyone geared up in PPE, in the full kit. What we did criticise is that there was no real planning of how that decision might need to be changed. And there were no trigger points where there needed to be either reassessment or if this happened, then go get your PPE gear.
So what did police officers on the ground tell you about the impact of those decisions?
Well, you'll see from our report where we quote directly many of those people who were on the ground that it was a traumatic circumstance for many of them. And some of them were injured. I think there were 87 injuries that required medical treatment.
And can you speak to training as well? There's some reference about public order training and the police response and I suppose the attitude to it and a recommendation to maybe bring the Defence Force in. Can you speak a little bit to, you know, what would the value be and what were the deficiencies potentially there as well?
Well, I think the value would be that every police officer ought to be trained in this type of activity, but that is probably impracticable because these events don't happen that frequently. Police currently train what are called PSU units that are specifically trained in this. What we have said is that training needs to be reassessed, it needs to be widened, and certainly there needs to be the purchase of more of the protective armour gear.
What value could the Defence Force bring? I mean, are they more skilled or more experienced in this kind of situation, and I suppose a mass situation?
I think police themselves would tell you that they benefited from the advice from some of the strategic planning advisors that New Zealand Defence Force provided in the course of their planning for 2 March. And I think I won't put words in the mouth of the Commissioner, but I think that that's one of the learnings from this, that there needs to be a wider assessment of that training.
Is there anything that you saw in this work that you've done that would suggest further investigations are warranted in any other area of government, local government? I'm not stepping slightly outside your purview, but is there anything that you think requires a follow-up?
I don't want to step outside my purview, and of course the terms of reference here excluded a lot of that. But as you'll have heard me say, one of our recommendations is that there's a wider cross-agency look at particularly the legality and the law around this, and this would include, for example, local authorities who under the Local Government Act now have the ability to delegate powers to people to clear roads.
I suppose were you concerned by anything that you saw in terms of ministers, government, anything else that raised red flags for you in the course of your work?
No.
Do you think that in light of it being an election year and sort of changing public sentiment and division, that how urgently do you think the laws need to be reviewed in response to sort of mass arrests and incidents of sort of public order?
It's a good question. These things are rare. You know, what we have said is that New Zealand hasn't seen anything like this since 1981 in the Springbok tour. So they're relatively rare, but that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be action, and we would recommend action start now.
So you've got 1,800 complaints that you basically put into a broader sort of pool. People might think that you dismissed an enormous number of complaints. Why have you not, how many complaints did you individually investigate?
Well, our process is that we looked at every one of those complaints and what we call shook the tree. We asked questions of police. We went back to many protesters or complainants and asked them what was happening. You need to remember that of the 1,905 complaints, only 84 of them were from people who were on the ground. By far the majority were people who were watching your live streams and saying, I agree with police action or I don't agree with police action, basically.
Does that dilute the credibility? Is that why you wouldn't investigate?
No. Well, what we have done through this review is investigate and report on those wider issues which were raised by the majority. And it's only when we have come to some of the more pointed individual complaints about use of force that we have gone to independent, separate investigations.
So how many independent, separate investigations were there?
19.
19. Can you give us an example of the sorts of things that you were looking at in those 19 investigations?
The sorts of things were excess use of force in an arrest, punching someone in the face, for example.
A large number of officers didn't have pepper spray. There was little conversation on when and how to use rubber bullets, and 2 officers threw bricks back at protesters. Was there a lack of tactical options there?
There wasn't a lack of tactical options. There was a lack of the range of availability, particularly pepper spray, for example. And this is one of our criticisms, is that police really didn't think ahead. While they were bringing police officers in from outside, you can't carry pepper spray on the plane, so they had to leave it behind. So there was some logistics around that.
Is it ever acceptable for a police officer to throw a brick at a member of the public?
We found that it was in self-defence.
You found that dozens of prosecutions had to be dropped due to police not following the right arrest rules, evidence rules, that sort of thing. Can you characterise, were these the, lower level charges around trespass, or were they including for people who will have done things like assault the police and got away with it because of a failing there?
Primarily the trespass issues, but I can't discount the fact that some of the charges withdrawn by police related to those sorts of assaults on police because of the lack of evidential collection.
The report also mentions some of the doctored evidence or doctored photos and videos or from Seattle, a few years ago. Can you talk about that and how that was potentially a feature of the investigation, and then more broadly about misinformation as an element of this particular project?
We were not, in fact, if you look at our terms of reference, we specifically included looking at the misinformation stuff. But what we did do in our assessment of the evidence we got was we cross-checked and used software to check metadata and things to make sure of the veracity of the information we were receiving. And on some of those we found that there had been a bit of manipulation by those that provided it to us.
Would that be usual? Would you normally see that in the course of investigations, or again, would this be a relatively unique feature?
I think relatively unique feature. We don't generally look at the veracity of material we get. We in the course of our usual work we get a lot of CCTV footage. Everyone's got their phone going these days, so we look at a lot of that. If we think there are issues, then we will check it, but it's relatively rare.
But you're satisfied about the credibility of the other material that you've used to base these conclusions and recommendations?
So what volume of the complaints were false?
Pardon?
What volume of the complaints were false?
We don't look at complaints as being false. We look at them and assess them and decide whether we're going to take them any further.
How much risk did you guys assess that new recruits were put in as a result of them being put into the line of operation?
We found that the roles that they ultimately ended up playing were not planned for roles. We also found that they hadn't been given sufficient training and support in getting there. The risk to them was not quite the same as the front line on 2 March, because they came in and took up positions after that had happened. But we found that generally that wasn't the right thing for police to have done.
Did you interview some of them, and did they reflect, I guess, that concern back to you?
We did interview, some did, some loved it.
The intelligence prior to the occupation was quite strong, and obviously it's been found police didn't adequately respond to that. From your investigation, why was the response to that intelligence
We
not
think
strong enough?
we think it was underestimated. We think that it was received in the context of a police district well used to dealing with parliamentary protest and demonstration. And you will see from the report we think there may have been some complacency around that.
Could you pinpoint what the single biggest failing you think was by police?
Lack of planning.
You do, the report does speak to the response of Parliament. Were they properly prepared? And I know there are some recommendations around a better plan for them. Again, can you just speak to that about what would need to happen in your view to protect Parliament from this happening again?
You'll see from our report that we think there's a wider issue here, that there needs to be greater talking between parliamentary service who run the security of Parliament itself, the Speaker's office and police, the City Council, and there is a section in there on the effect on the courts, which is another one of our major constitutional issues.
Was it disappointing that Parliamentary Service, I think Wellington City Council, a number of these organisations, partly because the police hadn't requested or flagged it up, like wiped a lot of footage that would have been quite crucial potentially for your investigation and I imagine for court or charges as well?
We did find it disappointing, and we think that's one of the lessons that'll come out of this, that that's not likely to happen again. What we didn't find anything nefarious about any of that. We didn't think it was some orchestration to get rid of evidence. It was just inadvertence and not thinking about it properly.
Did it restrict your investigation, and do you think it will have potential implications for the charges that are still active in the courts?
As to the latter part, I'm not sure about that, because evidence is evidence and there's other ways of gathering it. We would have been helped by it for a couple of reasons. One, the quality of it, and two, the relative independence of it. So we didn't have that, and most of what we had was not of that quality, of people's phones and of course live streaming and things.
So identification of individuals and that sort of thing, that could have been where it could have been quite useful.
It could well have been, yes.
In terms
Just on the
of
planning side, you found that in the two previous, or in one of the previous anti-mandate protests, a few months before, that the occupation police had developed a lengthy 25-page plan for how to deal with it. And I've seen that they've developed it for the other one too. So why didn't they do it for this? Was that the complacency that you were mentioning, or?
That's where I would land it, but you'd have to ask police why they didn't.
And I guess how much of an impact did that have on the initial response to the protest? The Speaker asked for police help to clear the grounds on night one, but they only had a handful of staff there.
We criticised the lack of planning, but as you'll have heard me say, that might not necessarily have affected anything that happened. Police didn't have the capability, frankly, to do it.
Is there a single course of action that the police could have taken that would have prevented all of this, do you think?
They could have arrested everyone if they could have, but that was impossible. So no, I don't think there's a single cause of action at all. Police, in all of these things, of course, have the balancing act of allowing lawful protest, yet keeping other citizens' rights protected. So there's always a balancing act here.
in terms of negotiation, obviously appreciating that it was profoundly difficult considering the leadership wasn't easily identifiable. But you had the Deputy Commissioner who was sort of going in and chatting to leaders over top of the specialist negotiation team who had no idea that the Deputy Commissioner was going in and negotiating. Mm-hmm. From your investigation, was there a potential there for negotiation to work, and did police hamper that?
What we found was that the police approach to negotiation would have been far better if it had been linked up. As you say, some people were doing various things and not letting the other hand know. We found that was a deficit. As to whether it would have worked, I'm not sure.
Coming back to the first initial response, and I think the words were overconfidence and complacency, was it a surprise, for example, that the police hadn't actually rostered any extra staff on, for example, those kind of, like that logistical response?
We found it was a surprise, and again, hindsight's always 20/20 vision. But as one of others of you said earlier, even 300 or 400 vehicles arriving at a particular time ought to have raised a flag.
But that was a specific decision as opposed to a restriction because of staffing resource?
Well, there was a decision not to bring in any additional staff.
And there was a fair amount of lead up. I mean, there was social media chat. This didn't just come out of the blue. So it's not unreasonable to think that those decisions that it was a consideration that was rejected as opposed to this has happened and we had absolutely no idea about it.
Well, it's one of our findings that what was done at the front end wasn't done as well as it ought to have been.
You said the police throwing a brick in self-defence was justified. What other actions like that did you find were justified?
Police had fire extinguishers used against them, and on I think 2 or 3 occasions officers used those fire extinguishers themselves to repel protesters who were assaulting them. There was the use of a Fens fire hose by police. I think we say in the report that the fire officers are not authorised and weren't prepared to use it, so police took that over with a view to pushing back protesters who were coming at them right at the end.
So would you say that there was the potential, and I know this sounds like an obvious question, but for fatalities on that final day and that on either side, and that it was lucky that that was avoided, I suppose, if that's the right word?
Well, of course I have to say that you never know what the worst may have been. We saw evidence, as everyone did, looking at the live streams, of significant violence, certainly from protesters towards police, and it might be said that a policeman hurling a brick is in the same category. We found that activity was justified because of the positions they were in. So I can't really answer it in the sense of did I think there were going to be fatalities. It was always a risk, I presume, when you have riotous situations.
But so you do think that people could have died on that final day?
What, of a heart attack, or you mean?
Well, I think, just given what happened and how out of control it was, that it was, to Jane's point, a very real risk that someone could have been killed.
There's always a risk if someone is throwing a brick at someone's head.
How much is your investigation cost?
How much does it cost?
Yeah.
Well, we're still got our 19 individual investigations to go. We were allocated 3.5 million, that's been publicly noted. I don't know where we're getting to with final costs, but I'm pretty confident we won't be going back to anyone asking for more money.
And when do you think you might wrap up with the 19?
Probably 2 to 3 months would be a lead time.
You said you had conversations with leaders of the different parties, for example, the Prime Minister, Wellington City Council, the Mayor, Wellington. Can you sort of say anything about those conversations, what they sort of came out to be, particularly like with the Mayor and that?
I think our report says that the Wellington City Council was generally very happy with the rapport they had with police, and the flow of information. While it wasn't always 100%, it was generally pretty good.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.